Was Bismarck a threat? Absolutely. Was she a competitive ship? Yes. Was she a super ship? No. If she'd been built for anyone else, I think pretty much any other naval power of World War II could have built a ship with her capabilities on significantly less tonnage.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Times Radio History Myth-Busting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we choose a moment from history and historical figure or a piece of equipment, and I sit down with one of our experts to talk through some things that people get wrong, and we'll also cover one or two things you may not know. Today we're looking at all things naval engagements and in particular warships, and I'm delighted to welcome for the first time on the channel the naval historian and YouTuber Drachinifel. Welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I should say you have a truly brilliant channel of your own dedicated to naval history that people should go and check out.
Thank you.
What do you think it is that people find so fascinating about naval warfare in particular?
I think it combines that element of the unknown because it's the sea. Along with, anyone who likes big machines. Well, warships are the biggest and most complex machines that humanity constructed for an extremely long period of time. And as a result, the complexity and the mystery of it all get combined into this sort of mythos of the sea, and the fact that the sailor is almost a separate person to the land dweller. And that kind of access into the unknown, especially because someone will, especially in the age of sail, might go off to sea and you might not see them again for 3 or 4 years. It's like, what were they getting up to at that time? What kind of weird and wonderful places were they visiting? Especially in an era when, there might be travel internally, but how many people in 18th century England are going to know anything about or have had a chance to visit India or the West Indies or Australia or anything like that?
And do you find you come up against myths about naval warfare all the time?
Yeah, it is unfortunate that a number of myths have grown up. Sometimes it's because it's very easy to reduce history down to a talking point or a sound bite, which is inaccurate just inherently. Sometimes it's misreporting that's happened at the time, or even propaganda that's been bought into at the time and has just become repeated as a common thing. Sometimes new information comes out, and sometimes it's just people inferring things based on other things that are actually not related to naval warfare at all.
Well, let's get into your 5 myths all about naval warfare. And the first one is something we've touched on before on the channel around the Battle of Midway. Was the Japanese Navy destroyed there?
So, this is one of these myths of like Midway. It's like, the Japanese Navy has been destroyed. It's now an onward march to victory for the US Navy. That's not actually the case. So the Japanese Navy's main striking arm at this point in time is known as the WWII. It's essentially all their aircraft carriers clubbed together. It's the force that hit Pearl Harbor. Now, whilst the Japanese carrier force at Midway did take quite the pounding, in fact, it was completely destroyed, that only actually accounted for 4 out of the 6 carriers that the Japanese had used at Midway, and the 2 largest, most modern and most capable, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were not present. And in addition to that, the Japanese were in the process of building or converting a number of new carriers of varying capabilities. And of course, the surface component of the Japanese fleet, their battleships and most of their cruisers, etc., weren't really touched by that battle. So when you get later on in 1942, the Battle of Guadalcanal or the Guadalcanal campaign, there's plenty of Japanese ships present there. They win a number of important victories. And even in some of the carrier battles, Santa Cruz and Eastern Solomons, the Japanese pull off kind of what they do at Coral Sea, where they technically win, but in terms of number of ships sunk and who was in charge of the field at the end of the day, they win those battles, but strategically, in terms of fulfilling their objectives, mainly reinforcing the troops on Guadalcanal, they lose. And then you go forward, so that you get the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese show up with quite a large number of carriers there. And then even by as late as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese still have a substantial force of carriers. It's not as large as what the US Navy can put on the field in both of those cases, but the ships are still there. And that doesn't even touch on the surface vessels. What you see with the Japanese Navy as time goes on is that the surface vessels gradually get attritioned away in a series of engagements, and the carrier arm never quite recovers from 1942 because of the loss of its skilled pilots, which they don't really have the ability to replace en masse the way that the Western allies can. But the Japanese Navy is still a very real and very ongoing threat well into 1943 and 1944. And realistically, if you want to look at the Japanese Navy and say, what point was their striking power not necessarily destroyed, but at least reduced to the point where stopping them became an exercise in putting ships and aircraft in their way rather than genuine concern you might actually lose the battle, that really is only the case perhaps after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. So you're talking quite late into the war. Midway is a turning point, but it's not the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and actually we've been lucky enough to have the historian John Parshall on the channel quite a lot, and he's made a very similar point, which I suppose raises the question, then why is there this fixation on Midway? I mean, clearly it was a significant victory. Is it just that, you know, in the same way the British like to hold up Trafalgar, Midway has kind of gone down in American folklore and it makes the US look better?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from what I mentioned in our introduction about sort of propaganda that's kind of been bought into a little bit, in that up until Midway, the Japanese Navy seemed to be unstoppable. So they've hit Pearl Harbor with no real, counterattack as a result of that. They've decimated ABDA Command, the kind of scratch coalition that various Western powers put together to try and stop them in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And even Coral Sea, although the Japanese don't end up reinforcing the invasion of Port Moresby, it does cost the Americans the USS Lexington and damage to the Yorktown in exchange for just a light carrier loss for the Japanese. So by the time of Midway, there is this impression, much like with the Germans in the early part of World War II, of can the Japanese actually be stopped? When the best result thus far has been, well, we stopped them from completing an objective, but it cost us more than it cost them. There's this mythos that's built up around the Japanese, and then suddenly at Midway, it completely turns on its head, because now an outnumbered American force in terms of ships, if not necessarily aircraft, has not just won, but completely decimated the force that the Japanese were using in exchange for losing only a single carrier. So 4 carriers down on the Japanese side, 1 loss on the American side, and the Japanese have been denied their objective. It's a huge turnaround for Allied fortunes. And thus, as with any major turnaround, kind of like the Battle of El Alamein for the British in the desert and so forth, it suddenly blows up into this massive deal. And it's a big deal, but it becomes an even bigger deal through propaganda. And suddenly, that carries on down the line as the thing.
Well, let's move on now to your second myth, and this one is around one of the most famous ships of all time, the Mary Rose. I think we all know this one. Did she really sink on her maiden voyage?
No, she did not. In fact, and this is the thing, we've got 2 relatively well-preserved ships from that period. We've got Mary Rose in the UK and Vasa in Sweden. Vasa does sink on her maiden voyage. And I think there's a little bit of, cultural cross-contamination in that respect, which means that people associate that famous sinking and they get it in their head that Mary Rose has sunk on her maiden voyage as well. In actual fact, Mary Rose at the time that she sinks is a very old ship, and she's actually fought a very successful engagement against the French several decades earlier. In the interim, she's been refitted because she exists in a time period where naval combat is evolving from the medieval style of combat, which is essentially land warfare with an increased risk of drowning, to a kind of one broadside to try and reduce the enemy numbers and then board. And by the end of her career, it's developing more into the lines of what we would see in the classic Age of Sail, with multiple broadsides, multiple salvos of cannon, etc., etc. And because she's designed for that slightly earlier career, she's rebuilt essentially into a much more heavily gun-armed vessel. And then when she puts to sea to try and deter the French at the Battle of the Solent, there's a fairly good argument to be made that the reason that she sinks is because they're trying to essentially load her for both activities. So she's heavily overloaded with cannon, she's got new gun ports, but she's also heavily loaded with longbowmen and other troops as if she's going to fight a boarding action. And between the 2 of them in a rather unfortunate breeze, she goes over. But she's at the pretty much the tail end of her career. If she had survived that battle, it's probable she would have been scrapped or broken up, more accurately, in the next 5 to 10 years, just as a very old ship. And as I said, a few decades earlier, when she'd fought as one of the English flagships alongside the Regent against a combined Breton and French force, the Regent and the French flagship both went up in flames together, which meant Mary Rose was kind of the last English flagship standing, and she actually wins a fairly vicious gunfight with the Breton flagship. So she had a fairly successful, if mostly spent in reserve, career before she went down. And that actually makes her archaeology all that much more interesting, because not only are you looking at a ship of the period, but you're looking at a ship in transition. And if you go and see the wreck in Portsmouth, you can actually, if you look very carefully, see which parts are original and which parts have been added or refitted.
But again, it's fascinating because it shows how pervasive some of these historical myths are, that here we are half a millennium on from the Mary Rose sinking, and we're still talking about myths around her.
Yeah. Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's one of those things when it comes to the age of sail, I think people would be very surprised by both what we know in some of the weird, obscure details that have been preserved, but also a lot of the stuff that we don't know. So even just looking at Mary Rose, when you see the Mary Rose Museum again, there's a whole debate about exactly how many decks did she have above the main deck with her forecastle and stern castle. Was it 1, 2, 3? How were they decorated? We've got the Anthony Roll, which is pretty good, but it's not necessarily a 100% one-for-one depiction of all the ships. And a lot of other Age of Sail ships and battles are like that. I mean, when it comes to even the Battle of Trafalgar, we know what all the British looked like because they all look the same. We don't actually know 100% what the French and Spanish ships looked like paint-wise, except for 2 or 3 where someone actually wrote down, these ships are unusual because they look like this. The rest of them, it's basically just artist convention in depicting them. And that's a pretty famous battle that you'd think we'd know more about.
Well, let's move on now to warship myth number 3. And this looks at another iconic ship, the Bismarck. I suppose in brief, was it all it was cracked up to be?
Yeah, this is a really big one. And this is a very clear example of propaganda, because at the time, Bismarck was made out in Allied propaganda as being this big super ship, this kind of ultimate threat to Allied supremacy at sea, which is understandable because partly you want to make your enemy look somewhat threatening, because then it justifies all the money you're spending to fight them and makes you look better when you beat them. But also, of course, Germany is doing its best to present the Bismarck as this uber ship. In actual fact, she isn't all that super. So in the run-up to World War II, there had been a naval treaty system which theoretically had limited battleships to a 35,000-ton displacement. So the contemporary Allied battleships, the North Carolinas and South Dakotas for the US, the King George V for the British, the Richelieus for the French, they all tried within reason to stick to this displacement limit, which of course meant there's limits on size, limits on armor, speed, how many guns you can carry, what size of guns you can carry. The Germans had taken the perspective of, we're going to say on paper that we're obeying, but we're actually not. So Bismarck was about 7,000 tons heavier than almost anything else that she was facing off against, including King George V and Prince of Wales during her one and only voyage. However, while she was this much bigger, heavier ship, in terms of her protection and her firepower, she is only really broadly competitive with those, with those smaller ships. She is a little bit faster than most, about 30 knots, but the French Richelieu class manages to match that without breaking the treaty. And the Italians actually build the Vittorio Veneto class, which is just as fast, if not faster, has an extra main gun, potentially a more effective armor system, and is, although it is also a treaty breaker, it's not as much of a treaty breaker as Bismarck. So it's a very fine line you have to go down, because objectively, as a warship, Bismarck is a big threat. She can, and as we see with HMS Hood does, take on peer warships 1v1, and she has a decent chance of winning. The same thing with her sister ship Tirpitz, although Tirpitz never actually fires a shot in anger against other battleships, but she could have done. So she is a competitive vessel, but she is not a super ship because she doesn't have any particularly great marked advantage over much smaller ships, and therefore she's also a relatively inefficiently built vessel, which is really reflective of the fact that the German naval designers had a big tranche of time in the interwar period where they just weren't allowed to design big warships in the aftermath of the Versailles Treaty. So they'd lost a bit of their expertise. So was Bismarck a threat? Absolutely. Was she a competitive ship? Yes. Was she a super ship? No. If she'd been built for anyone else, I think pretty much any other naval power of World War II could have built a ship with her capabilities on significantly less tonnage.
Do you think there's almost an analogy here to be drawn with tanks? I mean, we've spoken a lot about tank myths on the channel, and you think of the Tiger tank, for instance, had this fearsome reputation, and yet a lot of people would say, actually, give me a Sherman any day. I'd rather have a Sherman than a German type thing. Do you think there's a bit of an analogy that the Bismarck has taken on a status greater than its actual power?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of this mythos of superior German technology, which kind of goes around in the early Cold War and for some reason has stuck. And yeah, Bismarck and the Tiger can very much have comparisons drawn because yes, in the Tiger's case, it's a powerful tank. It has its flaws, but then you look at how much the thing weighs, and it's not really that surprising that it's got a bit more armor and a heavier gun than a Sherman. And then when you look at later Allied efforts, when they're building tanks like the Pershing or the Centurion towards the end of the war, where their hull weights are beginning to approach the weight of a Tiger or a King Tiger, and it suddenly turns out that actually, if the Allies are building a ship, or in that case a tank, to that weight, they can make something that's competitive or better. But there is a certain quality in just making your thing absolutely massive. It hides an awful lot of flaws.
So what for you then would you say was the best warship of World War II?
That's actually a really difficult one because you can quantify it in so many different ways. If you want to look at it in terms of which actually built, at least let's say battleship for minimizing the field, has the most firepower, the best speed, etc., it's got to be the Iowa class because they are bigger than most because they're built in a post-treaty environment. They're nowhere near as large in displacement-wise as a Yamato, and Yamato is often the other one that's put forward as the biggest, meanest warship. But it's kind of an efficiency term. Iowa and Bismarck can go toe-to-toe. During the day, Yamato maybe has a slight edge. At night, Iowa has a significant edge because of her radar. But the fact that the Iowa can do that whilst also displacing 25,000 tons less than Yamato is a big tick in her book. The disadvantage of using that as a point is, of course, the fact that the Iowas enter service relatively late in the war. So if you want to look at in terms of pre-warships or ships that accomplished a lot during the war, those are different categorizations. So a ship that accomplished a huge amount and therefore could be the best would be HMS Warspite. A ship that perhaps was one of the most technologically advanced in what it managed to get for its displacement would be something like the French Richelieu class. So there's lots of different answers depending on exactly how you want to quantify best. But that's the joy of naval history. You can have these discussions almost ad infinitum, and some people have.
Let's move on to your fourth myth now. We're heading to France for this one. How bad were French ships in World War II?
Right. So, were they terrible? This is another myth that goes around. There's the whole, the propaganda about France surrendering early on in the war, which doesn't really help matters. And also, to be fair, French ships, as I've often said on my own channel, they're kind of a set of extremes. You will virtually never find a French warship that is just okay. They either tend to be absolutely superb or utterly, utterly awful, with nothing in between.
It's quite a French approach to life, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but I definitely would agree with that. So in a lot of cases, it is a bit of a shame that the French, obviously, because of the early surrender, you don't get to see a lot of their ships take action. There's a few ships that joined the Free French Navy and we get a bit more mileage out of that. But when you look at something like, say, the Richelieu class battleships, if either France had stuck in the war or or both of them had decided to defect to the Free French, if you'd put Richelieu up against Bismarck instead of Hood, I think there's a pretty good chance Richelieu comes out on top. Conversely, the French heavy cruiser Algerie is probably the single best heavy cruiser built pre-war to the treaty restrictions. That said, her predecessor, the Duquesne, is probably the single worst heavy cruiser built pre-war in that it could be taken down by a particularly angry destroyer because it has essentially zero armor. And the same thing kind of applies for a lot of their destroyers, their submarines, etc. Their two sort of battle cruiser battleships, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, are very much a Marmite type thing. I quite like them, especially Strasbourg. Dunkirk's a little bit thin armored for my tastes, but your mileage may vary. So, yeah, in terms of French ships of the Second World War, unfortunately, we never see most of them put to a live fire test against enemies. So that's always a little bit of an unknown. But at least in terms of their on-paper capabilities and the stuff that we can measure, like their speed, their efficiency per ton, and so forth, a good chunk of French warships are actually quite remarkable for what they managed to pull off, especially considering the limited amount of French naval infrastructure that they have going into the war, which extends to the point that they even have to build Richelieu without her bow and stern. They build those separately and attach them after she's launched, simply because they don't have a slipway large enough to put the ship on.
I mean, that is really interesting. And you would say that this predominantly comes from kind of myths and attitudes towards the French anyway in World War II, everything from the failure of the Maginot Line to the surrender. It's just a bit of almost anti-French, I don't know if propaganda is too strong a word, but certainly anti-French sentiment.
Yeah, it's kind of like they bowed out early. They didn't fight with the rest of us. Therefore, their stuff can't have been that good, because if it was any good, they would have continued to fight. And I mean, there is a certain margin in that argument, not necessarily in terms of the quality of the ships, but there is an argument to be had about why didn't the French Navy continue to fight? Because obviously you have all the various navies of Europe, all the countries in Europe that are occupied by the Nazis, so Poland, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Greece eventually, and so on. And in pretty much all of those cases, their navies generally tend to just go, you know what, we're making a break for it and heading over to mostly the UK, and we're going to keep fighting. The French Navy is almost unique in that it's a European navy whose home country is mostly taken over by the Germans, with obviously a puppet government in Vichy France for a little bit. But most of the French Navy decides, actually, we're just going to stay put and not continue the fight, which is a little bit of a turnaround from what they were actually saying they were going to do up until maybe even a few weeks before the armistice with Germany was signed. And I think ill feeling around that, and the fact that all the other European navies showed an example of continuing the fight, is probably the root cause of why people sometimes don't rate French ships as they actually should.
And are there other European navies or global navies of World War II that get a bad rap in your view? I'm thinking particularly of the Italians. I mean, we've talked a lot about the Italian army maybe getting a bad rap. Is the same true of the Italian navy?
Yes, most definitely. And I think actually the army is pretty much the root cause of it, as like you just mentioned. I mean, let's be fair, the Italian army's performance in the early part of the Desert Campaign is pretty awful. But I think a lot of people have looked at that and gone, oh, well, the Italian army was pretty useless. With the best will in the world, the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, didn't really cover itself in glory at the same time either. And so people look around and go, well, where was a big Italian naval victory in the Mediterranean? Well, there isn't a big one. And so then they decide, oh, well, clearly, therefore, the Italian Navy must also be as useless as their Air Force and Army seem to have been in the early part of the war. And in actual fact, while there are some problems early on with Italian admirals who have perhaps been put in position because they're very good at the politics side of things rather than the combat side of things, the Italian Navy does score quite a lot of successes at a smaller scale with their special forces mining British ships in Alexandria and Gibraltar. And the other thing which I tend to bring up quite often is look at how many forces the British and the Americans put into the Mediterranean to deal with the Italian Navy compared to the Germans. Usually, in terms of big heavy surface forces, the approach of the Allies to containing the German Navy is 2 or 3 battleships and a carrier, maybe. That's what they reckon is what they need to contain Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, etc., etc. Then you look at the forces they devote to the Mediterranean, and suddenly it's 3 or 4 carriers at any given time. We're constantly replacing ones that are getting damaged or sunk. We've got half a dozen capital ships between battleships and battle cruisers. And ultimately, when you look at the landings that are eventually conducted in Europe at D-Day, yes, there are Allied battleships present, but pretty much every Allied battleship present at D-Day is there to shell German emplacements on land. They're not really all that concerned about the Kriegsmarine coming out to try and mess things up, except maybe with a few fast attack boats. Whereas if you look at the landings on Sicily and then later on at Salerno, not only have you got, yes, the bombardment ships, but the Allies have dedicated an entire squadron of battleships completely simply to act as a sort of a stop line between the landings and the Regia Marina, because they're worried that the Regia Marina might come out and contest the landings. And if that happens, they need that battle to happen far away from the landings, and it's going to be a fairly big one, 4 or 5 battleships aside, plus all the ancillary forces. Unfortunately, the Regia Marina, well, depending on how you look at it, fortunately or unfortunately, the Regia Marina doesn't come out, but that's largely due to a lack of fuel, not really a lack of motivation.
We should just mention, on the topic of how effective or ineffective the Italian army was during World War II, we did a whole episode of myth busting about Italian army myths, so go back and check it out. Let's come on to your final myth now about naval warfare. Yeah. And this is, I suppose, on the issue of warships more generally, do they all have the same armour?
Right. Now, this is an important one because it's very easy to look at the paper stats and go, right, well, this ship has 10 inches of armor, this ship has 12, this ship has 16, therefore the ship with 16 inches of armor is better. But as it turns out, the answer is no, for multiple reasons. Battleship armor is not, or warship armor as a whole, is not just interchangeable by thickness. There's a whole separate issue about, how much does it cover, where does it cover, and so forth. But that's not really the main focus for this element. The main focus for me is the quality and material types used, because battleship armor is, generally speaking, steel, but not all steel is created equal for 2 reasons. Firstly, there are lots of trace elements like chromium, molybdenum, nickel is a somewhat larger one, which are all introduced as well as just iron and carbon, and that affects the material qualities of the steel. So if you take, let's say, World War II British steel armor, that has a number of trace elements that make it physically a superior metal to, let's say, Japanese steel, which doesn't have those or has them in different ratios. And so if you have 12 inches of British-made armor, 12 inches of German-made armor, American, etc., they're actually going to perform somewhat differently. And then on top of that, you have a rather interesting fact for large-scale capital ship armor, which is what they call face hardening. So in the 1890s, they figure out that face hardening makes the armor much better. So that's where you take a big billet of steel, you forge it into a sheet of armor, but then what you end up doing is cooling one side very, very quickly and the other side much more slowly. So that creates a very hard face and then a softer face. And the reason that that's critical is that you want the steel to be as hard as possible because that's the best thing to resist incoming fire. However, the harder you make it, the more brittle it becomes. So you don't want the thing to shatter like glass. So you have this softer steel essentially backing and supporting it to stop the armor failing under impact. But then there's a whole discussion to be had, and it's a very technical engineering discussion about how thick proportionally you make the hard face compared to the soft face, and different nations have different approaches on that. And so you actually end up, and it also works differently depending on the scale. So if you're building, say, cruiser armor, you want quite a thick hardened face, but if you want to build battleship armor against much heavier shells, it actually works out that you want a slightly thinner face. And so you put all of these things together and you can end up with all sorts of permutations where, let's say, British World War II era manufactured battleship armor has both the correct face thickness and the correct material qualities that make it some of, if not the best armor in the world. Whereas if you go to a cruiser thickness, for example, then Italian or American armor, which has a very thick hardened face at that scale, is probably the best in the world, and all sorts of permutations in between. So while it's very tempting to just look at an on-paper figure, it actually requires a lot more thought if you want to calculate exactly what the various capabilities of the various battleships are.
Well, listen, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for taking us through those 5 myths. Before you go, we always like to ask our guests to give us a true fact that a lot of people may not know but should. What have you got for us?
Right, so my fun fact is that Admiral Fisher, who was in charge of the Royal Navy in the run-up to World War I, was actually one of the world's biggest pacifists. He absolutely hated war. And this might come as a complete shock to most people, because if you look at Fisher's writings and his letters, he is, you'd almost think he's a modern-day Twitter troll taken back a century and a half. He's always talking about annihilating the enemy, and we must utterly destroy them, and we must sail into their ports and gun them down before the war even starts, and all this kind of extremely bellicose warmongering talk. But when you look at his diaries, his papers, his internal letters, etc., what he's actually come to the conclusion of is that he thinks that mankind as a whole really wants to go to war and fight each other, which he doesn't want to happen. He doesn't see any real percentage or benefit in the big European powers fighting it out. He just thinks that's going to cause huge amounts of destruction. And as it turns out, he's right. But his conclusion from that is that the only way that people will not fight is if the person or the nation who appears to be on top at that point, obviously at that point Britain with her huge navy, if they appear to be so unhinged and so hyper aggressive that they're just looking for an opportunity to savage everybody like a rabid dog, then everyone won't fight purely out of fear of the presumed bunch of lunatics who are going to come along and set fire to everything they know and love. Which is basically he's doing a slightly more graphic and over-the-top version of what today we call mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons. People don't necessarily want to go to full-scale war because they think it's going to end badly for them. Of course, they don't have nukes back then, so Fisher's just taking the approach of, I'm going to appear to be a complete berserker on the idea that no one's going to want to test me, and therefore we don't have a war, which is his actual objective. So I think that's always very important when people are reading Fisher's writings. Yes, he sounds like a complete lunatic, but it's actually a very clever cover because he's desperate to try and avoid the one thing he's always talking about. And
he may have been a very divisive figure, but he basically transformed the Royal Navy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. He's kind of, I mean, I know it's Theodore Roosevelt's phrase, but he's very much a proponent of walk softly but carry a big stick. And part of his thing is, yes, he doesn't want war, but the best way to do that is to have an extremely effective and extremely large Royal Navy that makes everyone too scared to actually start anything.
Drachinifel, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Don't forget, you can check out Drachinifel's channel, and I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today for this edition of Myth Busting, but we'll be back very soon busting more historical myths, and if there's anything you would like to see us deconstruct, let us know in the comments below, and remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel Times Radio History on YouTube. That's it from us. Goodbye.